The grass barely moved. Wren had watched it for days, memorized the rhythm of the breeze against every brittle stalk that clung to life on the high ridgeline. Pale Ridge offered a clean vantage of the sun-bleached valley below, exposed, wide, and quiet. Nothing moved down there. No tire tracks, no foot trails, no thermal breaks against the cracked soil. She was alone. And for a while, that had meant control. She lay prone beneath a stretched net of sun-dulled mesh and dried grass loops, blended perfectly into the slope's shallow bend. Her rifle rested on a bed of sand-hardened earth, buffered by her pack. Every component had been pre-checked, optic lens cleaned, suppressor mounted, bolt tensioned. Range cards had been burned into her mind, landmarks mapped by shadow drift across the hills. To her left, the drag bag sat coiled and undisturbed, a dull smear against the dry yellow. The wind had held steady at 2 knots for over an hour, just enough to shift the net without betraying form. She adjusted the elevation turret half a click, more out of habit than necessity. Across the valley, a shallow saddle curved behind the low ridge, ideal terrain for an enemy convoy. But even the militants who operated this sector had gone silent. Her log showed no movement for over 24 hours. Still, her scope stayed fixed. At first, it was nothing, just a dark smudge near a scatter of rocks on the far rise. The kind of visual noise the eye filters out when it knows the terrain too well. Wren blinked once, zoomed in. The shadow hadn't been there earlier. Or maybe it had. She couldn't afford to assume. She inched her spotting monocular into place, rotating her head no more than 2 degrees. The glass caught the edge of the movement again, just a flicker, like something had shifted and gone still. Her hand stayed on the rifle, but the chill that settled under her ribcage wasn't from uncertainty. It was from something else. Something quiet. Too quiet. The shot came with no warning. A sharp crack split the silence, followed half a second later by the whisper of a round, parting air. Dirt exploded next to her cheek, sharp stones slashing a shallow cut beneath her jawline. A spiderweb crack split across the rock just inches from where her head had rested. Wren did not flinch. Her breath didn't stall, and her hands didn't hesitate. She slid backward from the scope, low and smooth, pressing her body into the soil as she backed out from the hide. The ghillie net fluttered slightly as she disengaged, but the wind covered most of the motion. She left the drag bag. It was too far, too exposed. Whoever had fired was already watching that angle. She dropped behind a shallow fold in the terrain and paused, face pressed into the earth. Dust clung to the sweat along her brow. Her mind sorted details, stripped away panic, and locked into options. Whoever that was, they hadn't missed by much, and it wasn't harassment fire. That round had been timed, ranged, and meant to kill. She had been seen. Crawling low, she began angling toward the drainage draw that wrapped along the ridge's lower edge. Her rifle stayed cradled under her torso, optic tucked in tight against her shoulder. Movement had to be slow, deliberate. There was no cover out here, only concealment. And concealment only worked if your opponent wasn't already reading the terrain the same way you did. The wind shifted, a subtle change, cooler now, brushing from the east instead of north. She paused, turning her cheek slightly to feel it pass. Not strong enough to carry scent, just enough to flatten grass that had once swayed inconsistently across the slope. It had masked her before. Now it could betray her. She pressed forward, elbows dragging silently through sand and shale. The sun dipped lower, casting long fingers of shadow across the ridge. Visibility would drop soon. That was both gift and danger. She needed to find a new hide before full dark. That first shot meant the duel had already started, and now every movement could be the one that ended it. As she slipped behind a patch of wind-worn scrub, she glanced back toward her old position. The drag bag still sat exposed beside the broken rock. The crack from the bullet was visible even from here. A splintered fracture etched into stone. A quiet marker. A missed kill. She turned away, not from fear, but from calculation. Whoever had eyes on her was trained. This wasn't some lucky shot from a hillside amateur. No, that was deliberate. It meant there was another scope out there, another mind, another rhythm. And now, the silence didn't belong to her anymore. Wren moved through the draw with her body pressed flat to the soil, using her elbows to inch along the shaded trench carved by old rain runoff. Each shift of weight was deliberate, practiced, methodical. The terrain here was fractured and layered, a blend of compacted dust, broken shale, and tufts of scorched grass that whispered against her sleeves with every movement. The sun was higher than she liked, casting shallow angles across the ridge and eliminating deeper shadows. But the draw offered concealment that could still be trusted, at least for now. She kept her rifle secured beneath her, muzzle forward, optic capped until the next stop. Every so often, she paused to listen, not for footsteps, not for breath, for silence itself. It had changed since that first shot. Not louder, just different. Like the quiet. Knew there were now two listening. About 100 meters to her left, the terrain curved upward toward the opposite ridge. She knew that slope by memory, had glassed it for 3 days before the shot came. From this angle, she could see the breaks in stone that framed its eastern shelf. Flat rock, a small scrub cluster, and a perfect sniper hide nestled behind uneven stone ribs. She eased the monocular from her vest and brought it to her right eye. The lens was scratched in one corner, but it still gave her the detail she needed. Her breath slowed, her body stilled, her eyes narrowed as she swept across the shelf. Then she saw it. Not a person, not a weapon. Just a glint, almost imperceptible, caught between the jagged edge of two rocks. It lasted no more than a second. The kind of flash that could have come from mica or broken glass. But Wren had trained for too long to mistake it. That was glass. That was a scope, and it was aimed her way. She pulled back and tucked into the draw again. Her heart rate hadn't jumped. There was no rush of adrenaline. Just confirmation. Whoever was out there hadn't fired to harass her. They'd been watching her, calculating, just like she had been. This wasn't a fluke or a militia rifleman hoping for luck. This was a trained sniper, maybe even one like her. She crawled westward, sticking to the contours of the slope, letting each movement mirror the terrain. She needed to flank wide, force the opponent to adjust. Predictability got you killed. So she slid past the dry bush line and rapped low through a basin, then up a shallow rise where a crescent of broken terrain might give her a partial angle. It was slow work. Her knees ached. Dust crept under her gloves. Each pause lasted longer now, her senses tuned to every gust of wind and every ripple of grass across the hillside. At the top of the incline, she built her new hide less refined than the first, but lower profile. No net. Just a shallow depression among dry roots and a pair of flat stones framing her rifle barrel. Her field of view wasn't ideal, but it gave her a line into the shelf where the glint had come from. She eased the rifle forward, then scanned with the scope. Her left hand adjusted elevation. Right hand settled under the stock. Her breathing flattened again. Through the lens, the ridge framed into sharp relief. The brush, the rocks, the angles. Everything slowed. She swept once, twice, and then paused again. Still nothing. But she didn't expect movement now. Not from someone that's skilled. She dropped back down and retrieved the monocular again, double-checking the ridge from a slightly shifted viewpoint. She caught the rocks at a better angle now, and for a second, she thought she saw a curvature metal contour, maybe a rifle frame partially obscured. The exact thing she would have done in their place. Then she heard it, a distant crack. The sound was dry, faint, and came half a second before she felt the thump of impact. A round struck close, slicing into the earth just behind her drag bag. She turned her head and saw it. The impact had kicked dust over the pack strap, just inches from where she'd left it exposed along the crawl path. She had moved, she had flanked, and still, they had tracked her. She pulled in tighter, rotating her body in place and drawing her knees underneath her. There was no scramble, no fear. But the conclusion was immediate and final. She was being hunted. This wasn't a mission anymore, it was a duel. Her gloved hand gripped the rifle tighter. She scanned again, searching the ridge, but the rocks gave nothing back. No flash, no hint of metal. Whoever was out there had taken their second shot with restraint, not desperation. That meant they were calm. That meant they were patient. And that meant they were dangerous. She reached for her data card, ran quick calculations in her head. Wind was steady at 1.5 knots from the southeast. Sunlight would hold another hour before shifting behind the western slope. Her position gave her less than 15 degrees of visible arc on the shelf above. That wouldn't be enough. So she waited. Not because she wanted to, but because that was what the other sniper was doing too. There was no advantage now. No elevated confidence. No belief in the one holding the scope. Just two minds pacing the same terrain, reading the same dust, watching the same grass bend under wind that no longer whispered it warned. The brush gave her just enough cover to disappear. Not vanish completely, no terrain out here could offer that, but the dry tangle of roots and dead stalks broke her outline. And that was enough. Wren had relocated again, further into the fold of the ridge, where the slope curved inward, just enough to buy a new angle. The soil here was loose, pale, and powder dry. It held no moisture, no scent, nothing to carry on the wind. That helped, but nothing in her posture reflected comfort. She stayed prone, stock welded to her shoulder, one elbow buried for balance, the other hand moving slow and exact as she built a shot. Before she did anything else, she set the helmet. It wasn't much. Just a sun-bleached standard issue with a strip of cloth tied around the back and a small plastic card wedged under the strap enough to reflect light if you were looking. She placed it 5 meters forward, tucked behind a bush, so it looked like it belonged to a figure just out of view. She didn't need it to be obvious, just visible enough to nudge a reflex. Once it was planted, she crawled back, reset her position, and dug in. Her rifle settled into place between two dry-rooted outcrops. The suppressor kissed the edge of the brush. She let the muzzle rest on dirt packed tight with her own pressure, absorbing vibration. No bipod. Not here. Too exposed. Too easy to track. Her left hand braced under the grip, skin warm through the glove, knuckles tight with stillness. Then she waited. Not to fire, to read. Wind told the truth if you knew what to watch for. She watched the way the tips of the grass turned at inconsistent intervals, not gusts, more like low-pressure pulses, passing through shallow dips and catching only half the terrain. The dust, too, held information. It didn't rise, not directly, but it hovered longer over the soil near the far ridge. That meant the air up there was stiller than hers. A tailwind might cut cross at an angle she couldn't see. She pulled a soft brush from her pocket and swept a fine line of dirt, then waited to see how it shifted. Barely. It was enough. Wren ran the calculation 3 times in her head, adjusting the dope for elevation, angle, and thermal distortion. Range was 620 meters, give or take 1. She knew where the rival sniper had fired from before. Same rocky shelf, same coverage of stone and brush. They hadn't needed to move, not with her doing it for them. She watched the pattern, mapped the breathing space, timed the intervals. The trigger press came at the end of a breath she never fully released. The report was soft, but final. Suppressed, yes, but still audible if you knew what to listen for. She stayed still, eyes open, no flinch, no shift. She watched through the glass. waiting for anything. A movement, a fall, a limb shifting. But there was nothing. Then, after 2 full heartbeats, the answer came. The sound was dry, clipped, a distant crack followed by the faintest rush of air. The round passed so close to her optic she thought she felt it, like a breath against her cheek. She didn't move. She didn't have to. The shot didn't hit. But it wasn't meant to. It told her everything she needed to know. She had missed. And worse, she had revealed her position in the attempt. The other sniper had waited, patient and still, and let her fire first. That meant they had seen the decoy and hadn't bought it. Or maybe they had. But they were better, quieter, smarter. She drew back from the scope and laid her cheek against the earth. The dirt was warm now, sun-baked and dry. But it held her weight. For a long moment, she simply listened. Not for movement, for what didn't happen. No second shot, no shuffling of boots. Just the wind. Shifting again. Brushing over the grass like a whisper that said nothing except that she was still alive. Her breath came back slowly. She hadn't noticed she was holding it. She felt it now in her chest tight, a little ragged, like her body hadn't agreed to the moment until it passed. Her right hand unclenched from the grip and flexed once, then stilled. She rechecked the ridge. Still nothing. Whoever the other sniper was. They hadn't moved. They didn't have to. They had just proven a point. Even with full prep, clean wind readings, and a controlled shot, she had missed. Not because she rushed, not because she panicked, because the other shooter understood the same thing she did, watched for the same patterns, timed the same drift, waited for her to make the first mistake. The helmet stayed where it was, still useful. But Wren knew now that the rules had changed. There was no third position to reset to, no shot she could take now without consequence. The element of surprise had passed. She wasn't outmatched, not yet. But for the first time in a long time, Wren felt the weight of equal ground. Wren climbed higher along the ridgeline, her fingers pressed into shale that shifted with every inch of movement. The slope was steeper here, uneven and dry, and the sun-baked crust flaked beneath her elbows as she crawled. She stayed low, breathing in short, measured bursts through her nose, not because she was tired though she was, but because her body had learned to mask exertion behind silence. Her muscles burned. Every joint in her shoulders protested each slow advance. She ignored it. There were no other options. Above her, the ridge crested into a fractured overhang of rock and collapsed earth, a place no casual patrol would scan. It wasn't ideal for a clean shot, but it was perfect for one thing disappearing. She slid beneath the overhang and began shaping a new hide. It took time. Every handful of soil she moved had to be silent. Every drag of the mesh had to follow the natural lines of the terrain. She pressed her rifle into a shallow notch, wrapped her shadow along the rock behind her, and vanished. There was no decoy this time. Nothing to give her away. She didn't need one. She had a better plan now, one that required only patience, misdirection, and an opponent hungry enough to believe what they saw. She keyed her radio once, no words. Just a brief silent code confirming no contact, no visual, mission in progress. It wasn't really for command. It was for herself. A tether. Something to say she was still in control of the op. Then she clicked it off and focused on the wind. It had shifted again. From this elevation, the crosswinds layered at different altitudes. She could feel it on her face, a soft push from the left while dust swirled from the right, tugged low across the draw. That meant instability. Any shot taken now would suffer unpredictable drift. But that was what she wanted. Uncertainty, confusion, terrain that lied to the eye. She reached into her pouch and pulled a small strip of reflective tape, already creased and dulled. She affixed it to a dry thorn branch and planted it carefully, angled, so the next sun flare might catch it. 20 meters away, nestled into a hollow. She secured a swatch of cloth, nothing more than a sleeve torn from an undershirt. The wind would flutter it once, maybe twice, if it shifted right. She calculated both placements to create a brief, irregular glint. Enough to seem like movement, enough to trigger doubt. Then she waited. Her scope stayed centered on the ridge opposite, the same broken stone where the rival had fired from. Her eyes stayed relaxed, just above the glass, scanning for the shift that would tell her everything. Minutes passed. The sun pressed harder against her back. She let her breathing slow to almost nothing. The fabric twitched. Then the flash came. Not from her own bait, from the other side. A shot cracked across the valley, sharp and tight, and struck just wide of the reflective marker. Dust jumped from the dirt. The bait had worked, but the real test came after. Wren was already pivoting her eye behind the optic, trying to catch the muzzle flash, just the faintest ripple, the shimmer of heat or glint of motion from behind the stones. But there was nothing. Only haze. Only light distortion and the wash of afternoon glare off the rocks. She had missed it. She stayed still, mouth dry, teeth pressed together in restraint. Not frustration. Not yet. Just confirmation that the other shooter was better at hiding than she expected. Or better at restraint. The wind didn't stop. It kept shifting, tugging the grass in one direction and then another. She watched it flatten in two places at once, one just below her bait, the other halfway up the slope near where her shot had missed earlier. It made the terrain unreadable, made the bait more believable. That was the point. But it also meant her opponent would adapt. Wren's finger rested near the trigger, not on it. She watched, tracked, waited. Her scope traced the edge of rock formations, followed dips in shadow, searched for anything out of rhythm. There was nothing. Whoever had fired was already gone or buried deep enough to see without being seen. She flexed her hand and let it settle. Her heartbeat stayed level. Her body was soaked in sweat, dust lining the inside of her collar. The overhang she hid beneath had started to radiate heat back down toward her skin. But she didn't shift. Didn't speak. The only sound came from the wind dragging across the valley in unpredictable intervals, pulling at grass like fingers unsure of which way to point. Her plan hadn't failed. It just hadn't landed. The shot had been forced. The opponent had taken it, just as she hoped, but she hadn't gained enough. No trace. No location. The bait hadn't drawn them far enough into exposure. She recalculated. The next move couldn't come from impulse. She needed a reversal, something invisible, not just clever. This wasn't about shooting faster or moving sooner. It was about seeing through the false shapes in the dirt, the ones they both kept making. The ruined stone sheepfold had collapsed in on itself a long time ago, its stacked walls now sunken and fractured into uneven ribs of rock. It was just enough to crawl inside. Just enough to vanish behind what once had been a livestock pen and now served as Wren's final position. She had chosen it, after her last bait failed. It offered no line of retreat, no backup angle, and no quick extraction. But it gave her one thing angle on the slope where her opponent had waited this entire time. If this was going to end, it would end here. The light was turning gold, rich and low across the hills, pushing shadows long across the dry terrain. The wind had faded to barely a breath, and the grass, once restless, now leaned as if waiting. Heat shimmer danced across the low basin between ridges, bending outlines, making even solid rock seem like it swayed. Her body had stopped protesting, not because it had recovered, because it had passed through discomfort and settled into the kind of locked focus that came just before failure. Her hands were stiff. The glove on her trigger hand was off now, tucked into her belt. She needed full contact. Her fingers trembled not from fear, but from hours of tension and silence. The sweat beneath her shirt had dried and returned again, crusted into the collar, clinging to her skin. She adjusted nothing. Her cheek was molded to the rifle stock, and her breathing was shallow enough to blur the scope only once every full minute. She had stared at the same patch of stone for more than 1 hour, watched the light move, traced the curve of every shadow, knew every speck of dust on the shelf. She had mapped the location in her mind so many times that even the smallest change would register like an alarm. Then it happened. It was almost nothing. Not movement. Just a displacement. A subtle deviation in a shadow that had held still all afternoon. At first, she thought it was the wind. But there was no wind. Not anymore. The grass below her hide didn't move. The dust beneath her muzzle stayed down. The air had gone still, heavy with the kind of silence that doesn't hold breath. It holds decision. She dialed the scope tighter. Her heartbeat didn't spike. Her fingers didn't twitch. The math was already done. Distance 622 meters, wind dead, drop 0.7 mils, time to target just under 1 second. Her reticle floated against the ridge. Then the glass caught light, not from her side, from the other. The rival's scope had moved just slightly and pointed directly at her. She knew the shape, knew the way lens curvature caught evening glare, knew, without question, that it was a sniper's eye staring directly back through the same tunnel of air, across the same brittle grass, toward the same conclusion. There was no panic, no surprise, only quiet. For a full second, neither rifle moved. There was no breath, no blink, no second shot. Wren's finger closed the gap. The rifle recoiled softly, the suppressed sound swallowed by the valley. She stayed in the sightline. 1 second, 2, no motion on the ridge, no return fire, no echo. The glass she had targeted no longer caught the light. The stone beside it remained still. A faint ripple of heat distortion drifted behind it, then faded. Dust settled back toward the earth, not from impact, but from the motionless air. She didn't move. The shot had felt clean. The numbers had matched. Her finger had followed through, but a sniper never confirmed the kill with instinct. It was either seen, or it wasn't. Still, the silence told her everything. There was no second shooter, no scrambling feet, no cover fire, just the slope, the shelf, the rifle, and the absence of response. Her eyes stayed locked in place, not blinking, not shifting. Her hand rested near the bolt, but she didn't cycle it. Not yet. Not until time passed and the wind moved again. Not until she could confirm that no one else waited behind that same scope. Only when her body forced her to breathe did she finally shift her weight. The glove stayed tucked at her belt. She wiped the sweat from the ridge of her brow with the back of her bare hand and let her focus widen. Her spine hurt. Her shoulder burned. Her jaw ached from clenching, but her mind stayed even. If she had missed, the other sniper would have fired by now. If they hadn't, then they were down, or they had never truly meant to win this duel. But she doubted that. The moment she saw the other scope, she had understood. The shot had already been decided. This hadn't been about outweighting. It had been about timing, control, certainty. She allowed herself one last breath, slow and full, then crawled back into deeper shadow. The duel was over. Wren broke down the hide with practiced quiet, packing nothing, disturbing little. The sun had begun to fall below the far ridge, dragging its last edge of heat across the grass. She kept low as she moved, body close to the ground, every step chosen, every pause measured. The valley held a stillness that felt earned, like a storm that had passed without noise. Her rifle stayed in hand, but she did not expect to raise it again. Crossing the draw took time. The terrain dipped unevenly, marked by faint animal trails and scattered shale, and she followed each with care. She kept her eyes on the shelf where the shot had landed, where her scope had found the glint and the answer. Her footfalls pressed into the dust with no sound, and her breath came slower than before. Not from fatigue, from what came next. As she climbed the final slope, she paused once, then again, then a third time. The wind had not returned. Nothing moved across the grass now. The distant trees, brittle and low, leaned without motion. Even the bugs had gone quiet. She found the sniper lying flat behind a line of cracked stone, their body angled just slightly from where her round had passed through. The shot had been clean. The rifle was still warm. It lay tucked in tight, barrel forward, scope focused, as if the operator had never shifted. The stock was wrapped in faded tape, the kind she'd used herself before the newer kits came through. It was the kind of rig only a professional would trust. The kind of weapon that saw hundreds of hours and no praise. Wren scanned for traps, tripwires, second shooters, nothing. She stepped closer. One round sat chambered, bolt forward, unfired. She crouched beside the position and looked through the scope. The lens was older than hers. Slight yellow tint. Some sun bleaching along the top edge. The field of view pointed straight toward where she had been locked on target. Still centered. Still waiting. The patience here hadn't been an act. It had been real. Whoever they were. They hadn't rushed. They hadn't flinched. They had watched. And they had waited too long. Beside the drag bag, half tucked under a cloth roll, she saw it. A brass mirror tag, dulled and scratched. Thumb-sized, clipped to a cord looped through webbing. It looked like the kind handed out during survival training. She picked it up and turned it over in her palm. On the back, faint and worn, were numbers. No name. Just a unit stamp. She knew it. It wasn't active anymore. But it had once been part of the same house. Delta. She held the tag a moment longer, then placed it back where she found it. There were no words spoken. None needed. She logged the strike into her mental report but didn't touch her radio. No voice check, no confirmation. The kill was real, but it didn't belong to narrative. It just was. The sniper had used a similar ghillie net. Slightly different patterning, but the same make. Wren didn't take it. She left the rifle too. Left the scope aligned. Left the pack and the tag and the final round that never chambered. This had been a duel, not a pursuit, not a mission that demanded credit. She stood for the first time in hours and looked across the ridge, back toward where her last position waited in shadow. The wind rose faintly for a breath, then stopped again. Grass bent, then stilled. The light had gone soft and colorless, the kind of dusk that leveled every feature until the world looked flattened and wide. She turned without ceremony and moved back the way she came. Her boot prints brushed out behind her, lost in the uneven dust. Her shoulders moved stiffly, her rifle held low, not out of threat, but habit. The valley watched her go. There would be no name on the report, no mention of the mirrored tag, just a time, a location, a confirmed shot, nothing more. She disappeared behind the slope where the grass met stone and the path narrowed again into nothing. Out here, no one calls your name. No medals wait. No headlines mark the moment when you see someone else's scope looking back through yours. But that's where the truth lives, between the breath you hold and the shot you decide to take. Wren didn't fight for glory. She didn't speak when it was over. She just did what needed doing and walked away. Her strength was never in being seen. It was in choosing stillness over noise, discipline over doubt, in knowing that patience, not pride, defines the one who endures. If her story spoke to something in you, something quiet but certain, take a moment. Reflect on the choices that shape you when no one is watching. Share your thoughts in the comments, or follow for more stories about courage that doesn't need a spotlight to matter. Sometimes, the most powerful voice is the one that never breaks its silence.